There we go. Welcome to our October Lift Every Voice Book Club conversation. We're really excited to be joined this month by Kaitlin Curtice. And Kaitlin is a poet, an author, and a public speaker, and she's also an enrolled citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. Did I say that right, Kaitlin?
Yeah.
And someone who's also grown up in the Christian faith. So Kaitlin writes on the intersection of Indigenous spirituality, faith, and everyday life, and the decolonization within the church. And her book, Native, which is our featured book this month on identity, belonging, and rediscovering God, is about identity, soul searching, and being on the never-ending journey of finding ourselves and finding God. And she also, I want to mention, has another lovely book called Glory Happening. This was her first book. And I just started reading this. It's a beautiful series of 50 short essays and prayers. Kaitlin's a really beautiful writer about finding the sacred in everyday life. So if you're inspired by Native, you might want to also pick up Glory Happening. So welcome, Kaitlin. It's really a delight to have you with us. And yeah, I'm excited for the conversation.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
So I just wanted to start us off by asking you how, what inspired you to write this particular book at this particular season of your life? What was calling to you? Yeah, that inspired you.
Well, I'm so glad that you shared my first book because, I think the life of a writer, at least in my experience, has been that, the books you write are just where you're at on your journey at that moment, what you feel you need to give the world. And so when I wrote Glory Happening, my first book, that was the point where I was like just really starting to deconstruct my faith. I was just starting to ask different questions. I grew up Baptist. I grew up with very, very boxed ideas of what I'm supposed to believe about God. And so I very much had the patriarchal male figure of who God is. And when I wrote Glory Happening, I just started thinking, trying to expand, just as an example, expand my thinking into God more as mystery than as this male being, right? And just that one change was shifting in me at the time. So I wrote that book and had that book for a few years. And then I felt like as I was understanding my own identity and asking those harder questions, and the way I describe it is I went from deconstructing into the work of decolonizing. It was like I had better tools, you grow into these things, you have better conversations, you follow amazing people on Twitter, and you start asking yourself these questions and examining these things. And I had more experiences within the church, good ones and bad ones, but a lot of bad ones that made me ask harder questions, honestly. And so Native was kind of my next step in doing that. And I felt like there were probably a lot of people who are also asking similar questions, just from different perspectives, or similar ones even to mine. And I just wanted them to have a resource that could, that could be a mirror, or that could show them that there is somebody out there thinking about these things. And I'm really grateful. It came out during COVID, which was crazy, and it's been crazy, but I think it came out exactly when it needed to, and I'm trusting that, so I'm really grateful.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kaitlin.
Yeah, the book came at a really perfect time in my own spiritual growth and continued deconstruction. What you just said about your first book to Native reminds me of Toni Morrison, who said that there's this white gaze when you're writing, and she does not write toward the white gaze. She was very intentional about that. But in my life, I found that I did write toward the white gaze because I was told to. I was actually in my first book. The editor was in Publishers Weekly saying that if you write a Christian novel for the Christian Booksellers Association in that CBA world, that if you did not have a multicultural cast, then it would not succeed. But he did not actually mean multicultural. He meant if you didn't have significant white characters, that your
Yeah.
book wouldn't succeed. And yeah, he was kind of right about that. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you briefly, did you, I think we kind of experienced the white gaze in Christianity, except instead of it being a little white man on your shoulder, like Toni Morrison said, it's a big white God.
Mm.
How do you feel and really what kind of questions did you ask yourself? And this was not on our sheet, I'm sorry. What kind of questions did you ask yourself as you were moving from book 1 to book 2, having to navigate the world of publishing as a Potawatomi woman?
Yeah. Well, you're asked that question. So when you write when you write your proposal for publishing, you're always asked who's your target audience. And that question just kills me every time because, I just want to be like all humans. That's my target. Like I don't want to say it's, 20 to 30-year-old women. I don't want to say, like I just want to write for people. But at the same time, you have to answer that question. And I understand that for marketing reasons, but I wanted to write a book that wasn't just for pastors to understand Native Americans better, or I didn't just want to write a book, I don't know, for white men to be able to answer harder questions. Like I wanted that because I want people to learn, right, and unlearn some things. But I also wanted to write a book for other Native women who haven't been able to voice these tensions before, or Black women maybe who haven't been able to voice some of these things, or or my atheist friends. I even wrote it for them because I hope that they can see something in the book, that something that they can identify with some of these questions. So I really hoped that I could write something that in some small way could reach a lot of people. That was a goal for me. And it was because of the questions I was asking. I didn't want something that was the stuff that I grew up with where it could only be swallowed in certain ways. Like I wanted something that would challenge and liberate and, and just use the power of story to bring people in. And because that's the kind of questions I was asking. What are the stories I grew up with? And do I believe them anymore? Who is Jesus? Because he's not the white guy that I grew up with, whose picture hung on my wall. And so asking all those questions, how am I supposed to pick a target audience when I'm asking these deep questions that I don't even know the answers to? So I mostly, people have said before, you ask a lot of questions in the book, you don't really give us the answers. And I was like, that's the point, I did that on purpose. I don't have the answers for you, but I want to help us ask better questions, I guess. And that's part of what I think decolonization is ask better questions and see what happens.
It really spoke to me, especially regarding my connection to Indigenous people. I tend to get kind of caught up in the Black struggle,
Sure.
And don't engage. I mean, I do, but not in the way that I felt truly from the heart that I experienced reading your book. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Kaitlin, I want to expand a bit. So you've talked a little bit about decolonization, and in your book you write about living a life of constant decolonizing, which I loved that image, and how your Native tradition helped you to connect to Jesus in this liberator form, as opposed to the kind of white Jesus hanging in the dining room kind of form. So I wonder if you could share a bit your perspective on what this life of constant decolonizing looks like, and how do we, what suggestions do you have particularly for white churches to embrace Jesus as liberator, to break out into a different perspective?
Well, I think the first thing that I always want to tell people, especially white folks and white churches, because I'm seeing a lot of excitement and then complete burnout and giving up. And I have told just time and again, I speak on this, I write on this, like, this is a lifelong journey. This is lifelong work. And I think that part of the problem of social media is that we have these big pushes for things like diversity, or read from Black voices, read from Indigenous and trans and queer voices, read our stuff, and then people buy all the books, and maybe they read them, probably not most of the time, and then people feel bad, and then they just go away, or they read them, but then they're like, well, what now? Because they want to make some quick fix, and that's not. I want people to know that decolonizing work is beautiful, lifelong, so hard, but also beautiful, beautiful, lifelong work. And I want to frame it that way, just because I want people to not like think of it as this terrifying, horrible burden, but to think of it as an opportunity, an invitation is how I write about it. So that's one thing I want to start with and say, because I really want people to get that. Like, even as churches, your church's lifelong experience must include decolonizing along the way, over the years, over the generations. I think that's the only way it's really going to work. And then, because I'm a writer, I tell people, please read books. And so don't just buy them, but read them. I'm changed all the time by the books I read. And when I read a memoir by someone, or when I read their work, I'm learning from them. Like, it is amazing to me how storytelling that has existed throughout time truly is as powerful as we act like it is. Like, it really, really is. Like, and I would say, take the time to invest in those stories, like, have your people buy the books, because when you do that, you're giving the money to you're supporting us, you're supporting Black women, you're supporting Indigenous women and queer women and disabled voices. Like, give us your money as churches or as individuals, support the actual people, and then really listen and ask hard questions and sit with the stories. And I know that sounds very oversimplified maybe, but I really mean it. Like, I really mean it, that when we read these stories, when we read books, which are such a gift to the world, maybe do these book clubs, have conversations with other people, don't do it alone, form communities of decolonizing, form your little decolonizing groups, and things will change. Read my book, and then this Thanksgiving, maybe you do something different, or you add in something that you've never done with your family before. Like, I think that will change people, and that has ripple effects throughout the generations. Like, those small acts that come from the things we read and the people we listen to that aren't the same people. When we do that, when we really listen and really read the words and really invest, I believe it will change things.
Beautiful. It reminds me a little bit of, I'm a part of the Benedictine tradition, in that I'm a Benedictine oblate. And two of the things that I love about that practice is lifelong conversion, which isn't like conversion like we maybe traditionally hear, but it's more about being open to a continual process of learning and discovering anew. And combined with that, with humility, which also isn't a word that most people really appreciate, but it's that sort of humble acceptance that it's a lifelong process, and that we're committing to continuing to do the work and continuing to show up and show up and show up. And it's not just a one-time thing. So so I'm grateful for this series of conversations, and just opening, myself and our community. So anyway, I just appreciate that.
I think something else that I've experienced is, I think people are scared to admit the ignorance they have, especially when it comes to Indigenous issues. We're not taught in school to know things. We're not taught anything. We're not taught stuff about Indigenous people, especially the celebrations of our cultures and our histories. And people feel bad that they don't know sometimes. And and so then they're scared to admit that first, and then they don't know how to start the journey. And And I don't want people to feel bad for not knowing something. I want them to challenge those systems that didn't teach them the things they should have known. And I think that that takes it away from the, like, the finger point of like, why didn't you know this, to, okay, we need to do some systems change. It starts with us though, but we need to do this larger change so that we don't keep repeating these patterns.
Well, and that whole finger pointing, like, it's very much part of that patriarchal church, system,
Yeah.
instead of acknowledging that we are flawed humans with vulnerabilities and weaknesses, it's like we're supposed to know everything. So even just that simple act of saying, I don't know, like, is a pretty powerful thing. Thank you. That's great.
I want to get back to stories. I love the journeying stories chapter. And I did feel like it was a prophetic call for us to return home, to ourselves, to our people, to the places, which I think, again and again, that you talked about in your book. But, especially for you and I, there are these ideas that our stories of our people are, we are noble savages. A lot of our spiritual practices are demonized because they are not the kind of practices that we see. And of course, the missionaries come in and they change the story. They really want you to become who they are. Largely. So how do we lean into who we are as people of color, or any people, when there are all of these voices telling us, no, it's wrong to venerate ancestors, or it's wrong to to do this type of practice. Those aren't our gods. How do we lean into who we are when even stories, even creation stories, something that simple?
I know.
How do we become fully who we are when, for me, I was scared. I didn't want demons. I didn't want, to not be saved or a Christian because I am looking into traditional African religions.
Right. Well, I mean, so many of us can connect to this, who are trying to decolonize our spirituality, trying to return to an indigenous worldview all over the world, indigenous peoples in Africa, here, like, in what we know as Canada, all over the world, the Sami people, there are indigenous people all over the world who have been interacting with the earth in a sacred, beautiful, God-given way. And what Christianity has done is called that pagan, right? Like and savage, or whatever these words we want to use. And I remember, I'm not sure what provoked me, but I was like, it was something on Twitter, I'm sure. And I got to a point where I was like, you know what? If me being connected to the earth in any way makes me a pagan, then that's what I am. I'm done. I was just kind of like, forget it. I think it was, it may have been, I think it was the thing at Union Theological Seminary had a service where people brought house plants and they apologized to the plants. They had this sort of a service of apology and lament to these plants. And the progressives of Twitter, the progressive ones, and I'm sure the conservatives too, but a lot of progressives were like, this is, all the things, right? This is not Christianity. And I was like, okay. So I changed my Twitter handle to like, Kaitlin, probably a pagan. And I was just like, you know what? Like, I'm just gonna like start claiming this title, because if anything that's barely outside the lines of what you think we should be, if that's pagan, then absolutely a bunch of us are pagan. And we're just gonna, like, I'm just gonna start being proud of that, because and it just, it's so interesting. And what I realized though, over the years of my own journey, is that once I started looking, I'm like, oh, that person's trying to connect to her ancestors too. You're trying to do some of these things too. I'm not the only one who's having these questions. I'm not the only one who's trying to decolonize my ideas of creation narratives and the afterlife, or these big questions that have been so boxed up and packaged for me for so long. I think that what gets a lot of us through it is to know that we're not the only ones asking those questions, that there are indigenous peoples all over the world throughout history who have been asking these questions. And when we get colonized, we have these seven fires prophecies in our culture. It's kind of like the story of our people. And there's this point in the story, we're colonized and we're like that for a long time. And then we come to this generation that has to choose a way. Are we going to keep staying colonized, or are we going to start returning back to who we are? And it's this kind of fork in the road. And that's a really hard question. That's a really hard part of our journey. But we have to decide who we are and what we want to be. And I think that all over the world, people are asking that same question, how do we want to connect to the earth and our ancestors? And for me, it helps me every time I have a conversation with someone like you, where I know I'm not the only one. It just like keeps the fire lit. And then I'm not so afraid,
Mm.
Yes.
I love that. Yeah.
I call myself witchy. So
Mm-hmm.
on my Twitter, it says
Oh, do
witchy.
you? Yes.
Yeah, it's funny because I used to refer to myself as a pagan Benedictine, and and years ago I wrote a book about praying with the four elements from a Christian perspective, because if you actually look at the Psalms and St. Francis and Celtic spirituality, it's like the elements and nature is all in there. And I wrote it, like, I remember I wrote that book a little more cautiously because I was aware of, that gaze of like, what, where, is she going to cross the line? And then a couple of years ago, I wrote a book called Earth as Our Original Monastery. And I had realized when I got to that point, I was like, I didn't really care anymore.
Yeah.
And it's funny because there's actually an Amazon review on my on the book that calls me a heretic, which I'm a little bit proud of. So yeah, exactly. So, and it actually kind of leads into my next question, because I actually live in Ireland, and one of the things I love about living in Ireland is that the Christianity that developed here in the early medieval times was much more in congruence with the pre-Christian Celtic pagan tradition, however you want to name that. And I find that that's why a lot of people are really drawn to the Celtic path, because a lot of people do have Irish ancestors, and it's maybe the closest thing they have to kind of an indigenous way of knowing is to reconnect. But and part of that is language. And I've lived here many years. I haven't learned Irish yet, but I know a lot of the words. And I just went to a beautiful art installation as part of the arts festival here about the Irish language. And they did this gorgeous, you moved through these different rooms where people were telling stories about the power of the language, and then how it was taken away through colonization, and then the reclaiming of it. And I actually was weeping through the entire thing because it was so powerful. So I wanted to touch in with you because you talk about language and how praying in your own native language, revealed new things to you, or, touched you in ways. And I just wonder if you could talk a bit about language, because I think a lot of, particularly in the American church, people are so disconnected from maybe what their ancestral language is and what that power is.
Yeah. So I didn't even know we had our own language growing up. That was not,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't talk about those types of things in our family, at least. It just wasn't part of our conversations. And so I was a young mom, and just I don't know how it happened, but I stumbled upon a language course from my tribe, and I'm so grateful they have an online course so I can learn from anywhere. And that's a beautiful aspect of the day that we live in today. We have very few fluent speakers left in our particular band. The I don't know how to explain it. Potawatomi, we're separated into bands in these different parts of the country. So my band in Oklahoma, we have, you know, few speakers, and this is true of many indigenous tribes. We, you know, have lost a lot of our holders of our culture and our languages, and COVID just exacerbated that of a lot of our elders. But that I remember the afternoon standing in our little apartment in Atlanta, and I, you know, turned on the audio of this prayer in Potawatomi, and just it just broke me open, is the best way I can say it. And you know, I've always prayed in English my whole life, or I've a little bit of other languages I've learned along the way. I've tried praying in them because I enjoy languages anyway. But when I realized, like, I have a language that I can claim that I didn't know about until now. And so I know I still know this one prayer, and I'm trying to memorize a much longer version of it. But it's such a gift, and I've taught it to my kids. And so sometimes when we smudge together before they go to school, my oldest son will just start praying it right away. Like, it's just, he knows that that's what we do. And it just really amazes me that I can have that. And it just, I don't know how to describe, maybe it's safety, or it's just feeling like home, coming home, when I can pray in Potawatomi instead of English. It's just, it holds a different space inside me. And it's more expansive at the same time. And so, yeah, it's just been an absolute gift. And of course, I'm not anywhere near fluent, but I've recognized that learning the language and reclaiming that for myself is part of my self-care. And it's an aspect of our culture that I can celebrate, instead of it being the traumatizing part. Like, there's just so much, like, there's things we can celebrate, and then there's the trauma that everyone likes to, you know, the trauma is what gets into the news. The hard, horrible stuff is the stuff that we talk about out there. If it was all the amazing, beautiful things, that's not going to make it into our news cycles, right? You know? And so the language is something I can go to and know that I'm going to learn more about myself here. I'm going to learn more about the culture here. I'm going to be able to reclaim something that could be lost. And that's really powerful for me. And I don't think that will ever go away. And again, it's that lifelong journey. Like, I don't know if I'll ever be fluent enough. But every new word that I learn, like, means a lot to me. So
beautiful. And then there's this sense of speaking those words, knowing that your ancestors spoke them, that just feels incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
In your dedication, you dedicate it to your ancestors, first of all, but also to Rachel Held Evans.
Yeah.
Could you talk about your friendship with her and how she changed your view of the church?
Yeah. Rachel was, first of all, I had Twitter for years, and I hated it. I didn't know how to use it. So but when I realized, like, okay, I'm going to be an author, I need to learn how to use Twitter. And one day I stumbled into a conversation that Rachel was having with someone else, kind of an argument. And I commented, and then Rachel went to my blog, which I had at the time. I didn't have a book yet. And she shared a blog post of mine. And that day I went from, however many followers, it like tripled, of course, because Rachel shared something. But it wasn't just that. It was just right away we felt like a friendship had formed, even on Twitter, that's just incredible. That is truly a gift of social media. For as toxic as it can be, I have met so many of my good friends there. And Rachel was one of the first for me. And she just, like she has done so many people, she just took me under her wing and invited me to speak at Why Christian, and endorsed my first book, and just held that space for me so beautifully. And that in and of itself, like, that she accepted all of who I was, that was the gift, that I knew maybe maybe there's something in the church that I don't have to give up on yet, if there are people like Rachel who truly care. And like my friend, like Nadia Bolsweber, who I also met through Rachel, like friends that I know that they see me fully as I am, and they're not afraid of that, and they're not worried about that, and they actually like it, like they actually care and want all of me. That changed everything, really, and helped me knowing that Rachel wasn't afraid to ask hard questions helped me know that I would be okay asking them too, you know. And every new book I write, everything I just think about her, and every hard question I ask, I know she would be proud of me for asking it. And I think that that's what she continues to give to a lot of people. But for me, like, I'm still not afraid to ask those hard questions because she did it all the time. Oh, and she refused to give up. So
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
beautiful. It makes me think of just the power of mentoring, and
yeah.
I've been asking myself that question a lot lately. And how do we reach out, yeah, and help lift others up in that way? And it kind of connects me back to this. You talk a lot about in the book about the spiritual liberation is tied to one another, which I totally believe. There was a Unitarian Universalist minister named Jeremy Taylor who was a dream worker, and he talked about how salvation it's not an individual sport, it's a team sport, and there's only one team. And I loved that. I'm not really a sports person, but I really loved that metaphor because I could get behind that, and that sense of like, I think a lot of times people don't see how intimately, tied together our own freedom is. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, and do you see a way to sort of spark that awareness or that knowing, particularly in white persons who may not be as conscious of that? I'm sure most people of color are aware of that, but
Yeah, I think, just a second, my dog's at the door. Like, you can come in. Sorry. I have a large Weimaraner who.
Oh, I love Weimaraners. Oh.
Very good. Okay. So yeah, that comes back to the whole, like, when we have these conversations, of course it's on an individual level. There's decisions we all make. But when we hi bud. But when we if he could talk, he'd tell you lots of things. When we understand that, like, our this idea of kinship, we are made to be connected to each other and to the earth. Like, there's no way to get around it. So that means that the decisions we make, the lives that we lead, are connected to each other. They are connected to the creatures of the earth and the waters and the rocks and everything. That in and of itself, like that like shift in mindset, that is so. In the church, we learn that we're all family, sort of, right? We all have to be together because our faith is what binds us, but that's not really the same thing as kinship. That's not the same thing as like we were sacredly created to have a reciprocal relationship with one another in the earth. That feels different, right? Like this, it's like there's a string that's connecting us to each other, and you can try to cut it, but it's like made of something magical, and we can't cut it, and it's always connected. So anything that we do is going to affect each other. There are going to be ripple effects. I think that changing that mindset really does sort of shift something big in all of us, if we can begin to grasp that and understand it. And then what that does is, if that's always in the back of our minds, then the work of like solidarity or allyship, of course we're going to make mistakes, but we do it with different intentions, because we know that we have, like, that we are each other's, we're all we've got, sort of, like, we are what we've got, and we have to be in it together. And so that's why I really wanted to write about that, how we do sort of the things that we do and the ways we exist are connected. Our oppression, when someone's hurting, we're all hurting. That whole idea is true. Like, the things that we do to each other affect all of us. So the systems that we need to fix, I mean, obviously there are oppressed peoples who are going to be at the center, who are most important, but we are all hurt by the things that we do to one another. And to fix that relationship is to practice kinship, Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And I love that idea of the reciprocity of relationship with nature and all of creation, because I know in Christianity it's typically more of like a stewardship model, which still feels that very patriarchal sort of top down, like I will deign to take care of you, as opposed to recognizing how intimately intertwined and that we're impacted as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful.
So let's talk about naming the stolen land that we are standing on, which I think is really, really beautiful. I asked a few of my friends about this, my Black friends, because my best friend is a white woman, and we often teach together. And we're teaching a class called How to Be an Anti-Racist Writer.
Wow.
So we didn't do it the first time, but when we were going to teach it again, we didn't end up doing it, but we didn't end up teaching the class. I mean, she said, well, I want to acknowledge the people whose land that we sold, and can we do this? And this has been going on in a lot of conferences and events. And so I asked my Black friends, I said, what do you think about this? And the few that I asked, the concern was that we didn't want it to be something performative.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about, I'm visualizing Nancy Pelosi taking a kneel with the kente cloth.
Yeah.
And I know that it was a very well-meaning gesture, but did it work?
Right.
Because she had just taken a kneel without the kente cloth, and it wasn't just her. It was, it was a group of politicians, and it was a little complicated for me and other people. So I asked myself, what is my resistance to this? And even though I do think it's a beautiful gesture, and I think for one, I didn't want it to be performative. I wanted it to come from the space of true kinship, and I wasn't quite there yet. I was at respect, and acknowledgement, but not quite kinship yet. And I really wanted it, even though I do find it extremely important, I wanted it for me personally to come from the heart. And you talked a lot about this, just in the way that you talked about Elizabeth Warren. And, if you're going to acknowledge your ancestry or your DNA, are you going to are you going to separate that from real relationship, with the people? So I don't know, I guess I want to ask, what are your thoughts about how this can go wrong? And how do we fix it?
Right. Thank you for asking this. And there's so many things like this where we know people's good intentions, but we also know it ends up being performative. There's so many things that have happened like this, right? And I love that you are talking about it from, are we doing this out of a space of kinship, or are we doing it because we just think we need to, or because it's now relevant to the time we're in, and that I have learned just from listening to other Indigenous folks too, especially in academia, because that's where a lot of this is beginning to happen, is in academic spaces. But in those spaces, it's completely for show. It's those institutions, which many institutions, first of all, are, built on stolen land and have not made any attempts at relationship with the tribes that are still there, so completely performative in the fact that there's no relationship happening anywhere, to be seen. And so that can be problematic. And I listened to an Indigenous podcast in Canada, and they were talking, because in Canada, they've been doing these things for years. This is very new. In the United States, people don't know what a land acknowledgement is. So I guess for those who don't know, I should explain that as well, that a land acknowledgement is meant to be at the beginning of a ceremony or an event or any gathering. You name the people whose land you're on. And when I do one, I like to acknowledge the land herself as a relationship as well, that we're humans. So let's remind ourselves that before this building was here, the land was here, and it will always be here. What can happen is it can be like these natives used to live here and they're gone now. Well, that's not always true. And so a lot of times it's just missing what it's trying to do, and there are certainly guides online that you can follow. Native-land.ca, you can share that later with everyone, tells you whose land you're on and gives examples of land acknowledgements and gives you ways to connect with those peoples. Like, it's an amazing resource. So native-land.ca is wonderful. I've used it a lot because I do land acknowledgements when I travel and speak, but at the same time, I'm doing that to inform the people where I'm speaking. Do you know that you're on native land? So in a way, even saying it out loud is like, oh my God, you're right. And I know that it has affected people. But what comes after I leave? Are those people going to go, and probably not most of them are going to go connect to the tribe or try to learn more, right? So in Canada, the conversation has been, should we even do this anymore? Is it even, is anything coming from it? And what I have understood from listening to other Indigenous people, and what I feel is that, when you do these land acknowledgements, there should be a plan of, a statement of action, or a plan of some statement of intent of what are we going to do now that we know this, knowing that the Indigenous people are still here, knowing that we're, even if a lot of people are gone from the land where you might be, knowing the history, knowing what happened, understanding all of that, that's a huge step in the right direction. And I want people to start educating themselves on the things we did not learn in school, but at the same time, what do we do? What comes after that? Like, what comes after the kneeling? Does it change anything? I don't know. It's a hard question. And I've had this conversation with so many different people. And what I appreciate most is these questions where you're asking, should we do it? What's the intent behind it? How do we do it right? And a lot of times I don't fully have an answer. I just know that, like many things, good intentions aren't always, like, they're not everything, there has to be more. And I think a commitment to kinship is a really great start, to have more, to expect that there will be more coming beyond just this statement, Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I want to read just this short section that you wrote, because your writing is you're a beautiful writer. It's often very poetic. And you talk about the ancestors of the Potawatomi people were people who watched. They watched for winter to come, to the time to tell our stories together in the elders' time. They watched the maple trees for the time to make syrup. They watched the moon for its cycles. And I loved that image, in part because our community, Abbey of the Arts, is very much rooted in contemplative tradition. And so a lot of these conversations we're having, my kind of foundational question is, by reading from a broader perspective of voices, how does that illuminate our understanding of contemplative tradition and practice? What difference does that make? And how does it enrich our understanding? So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about this gift of watching in a world that's always rushing and doesn't really want to pay close attention to anything.
Yeah. I think, well, first I have 2 young kiddos, and so they're always helping me see. That's the gift of children, is helping us see from a different perspective, or helping us connect back to our own childlike selves, that curiosity. I think that this connects to what we were talking about earlier, that as people, we kind of think of ourselves as like, we steward the land, like we get to control, we're over it, we can take care of it, or we can subdue it, but we are the ones in charge. And I think that when we turn that totally upside down and realize that when we sit beneath a tree that is like so much older than we are and has seen so much more than we could even imagine, or when we're sitting by a river, like, do you know how old that water is? When we sit by the ocean, I think about what ships have sailed on those oceans and what beautiful things and what horrible things that water has witnessed and how it has held history, on its skin. Like, I just think about how sacred and huge that is, and that we are so little and and should be absolutely humbled to get to be near these beings that have so much to teach us. And I think that when I was able to reframe that for myself, I realized that that's a really important lesson, especially for the church to learn, because we have been taught to be that we're the most important beings, and to kind of recognize that we're actually not, and that we get to be in relationship and we get to listen and learn and watch. And I think that keeping watch is like not just from a stewarding perspective, but from a complete trust and curiosity of the world around us perspective, like I think ants are the most fascinating creatures because they're tiny and we could step on them, and we do all the time. And yet they have an entire world and these systems they build these, masterpieces of colonies and kingdoms, and they carry like, the other day my kids found an ant carrying a feather. Like, it was a big feather. This one little ant was carrying a giant feather. To us, a feather is nothing, but to that ant, a feather is a lot. And, and that ant had somewhere to be. And I just thought, like, you're amazing, like, it is amazing that these creatures, they're just going about their daily work, but they have so much to teach us. The world has so much to teach us. And I think that's so much of the contemplative life, but that truly is good medicine for us in a time we live in when things are hectic and we get in our head so much. I mean, what I need more than anything every day is to get out of my head. And nature and music and art and moving our bodies and children and pets and lighting candles and drinking water. Those are all those kinds of things that get us out of our heads. And those are all things that connect us to the contemplative part of ourselves, or the emptying out meditation, like just getting out of our heads and into our bodies again, Yeah. And the earth teaches us to do that. And that's such a gift.
Yeah, that's so much the gaze of the mystic, that you were just describing, and to honor that, to honor that everything has something to teach us, and to honor the humility that takes to enter into that reciprocity of relationship. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. I think we have time maybe for one more question, Claudia, if you want to bring it on home.
And this is very important to me. The great African American writer James Baldwin said, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. Tell me, how do you temper your anger at injustice, which we should all have, with I'm thinking about your cup that says, give me a refill, the patriarchy isn't going to fight itself. It reminds you that your words are for the purpose of peace. So how do we temper our anger and root our activism in peace, but more importantly, root our activism in great love, universal love, kinship?
Yes. I love this question, and it has been really empowering for me to learn that rage is okay, because I grew up, Baptist, people pleaser, pastor's kid. Like, I didn't rock the boat. You don't get mad about things. Like, things are all okay. You just keep to yourself. You obey all the people that you're supposed to obey. You obey God, just be quiet and smile, and as I've been on this journey, recognizing that rage has to be there. like that quote, if we're going to be awakened to anything, any sort of injustice of our own people, of other people's, there has, like, rage will come, and it should come. And I think I write in the book about how I want my kids to see me angry. Like, I want my children to see me really upset about the things that happen in the world, but then I also want them to see me channel that into whatever I need to do, whatever my particular thing is to do in the world. And I think that we all get to be angry, and then we all get to use that anger for the gift that we each give. And I think that that's another thing people get overwhelmed by, is they think they have to do everything for every cause all the time. And that's not possible. That's completely burnout. And so we all have to be okay with saying, today, this is what I'm angry about. And today I will choose to, fight for peace in this way. I will choose to fight for love in this way. And I think the other thing is this whole, contemplatives can't be angry thing. And that's not true. And our contemplative practices, or our art, or our words when we write, whatever it is, we are fueled by anger a lot of the time to do those things. And then I think that's the importance of self-care as well. Self-care is not just for us. Like, it's for the work we do in the world. It's for the communities of people. It's for the solidarity. It's for kinship. Like, that whole, we can't, what is it? We can't, like, if our well is empty, we can't fill other wells. We have to be willing to stop and say, okay, I need to refuel for a second. Cause that rage is exhausting, and it'll wipe us out, even if we're doing the good work, even if we're turning that rage into love, or creating those channels, that's exhausting work. And if we don't stop and say, all right, I need to get off social media for 2 weeks, I'll be back, and that fear of missing something important, but we can't hold it all, our rage, there has to be an ebb and flow of it, or we can't exist that way. Rage exhausts me. When I have a day where I'm angry, the next day I am like done. Like, and I have to take that day, and then I have to, get back to the rage another time. But I mean, it really is like an ebb and flow of it. Like, I think it has to be. We can't survive unless we let it be that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kaitlin, as we kind of bring this to a close, I just wonder if, before we end, if you would just speak to, since you published this book, and you said you published it in the midst of the pandemic, which of course is still going on, have the conversations you've had since then with interviews and all of that, has it made you more or less hopeful around what's possible? And were there any moments in particular that kind of helped galvanize that, or give you a sense of the impact of your work, I suppose?
There are days where it's not so much the rage, like Claudia's asking, but it's like just the heaviness of, what am I supposed to, like, what can I possibly do to help with anything right now? Because it is utterly exhausting, and I think that I remember when COVID first happened, on Instagram, there were all these musicians who were going and doing live concerts from their homes. And, one of my favorite musicians is Glenn Hansard. And he did a concert from his like kitchen. He's just like, drinking a bottle of wine, doing a concert. And it was so beautiful. And it was exactly what I needed. And I think that something that has brought me so much hope is this passing back and forth of creatives. How, if I don't have the right words one day, I know that there's another author out there who does, or I know there's someone's painting something that's going to completely change someone else's life, or someone is singing a song that's going to be the best medicine for someone else. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things, is that we have to remember that we are, a giant community of creatives, I guess, and that art in every form is always going to be a gift to the world. And like producing my book and then I had a horrible burnout. Like right after it came out, we moved to Vermont, and I lived there for 11 months and basically just, I called it my cave. And I just kind of, I still had some work to do, but I didn't have much left. I was just, you know, I was just there trying to like learn how to cope. And it was a beautiful season of hiding, sort of. And I needed that. And I needed to rely on other creatives to get me through, so that now I'm writing my third book. And I know, and they helped me, you know, they helped me get to this point. And so I'll pick up and I'll do my work while someone else can rest. And then maybe they can, you know, it's like, it's just, we're like passing the batons back and forth.
Yeah.
That gives me a lot of hope.
That's a beautiful, beautiful image. What can I ask what the next book is going to be about?
Yeah, it's the tentative title right now is Resistance for the Rest of Us, and it's about everyday resistance. So it's about how, you know, when we garden, when we sing a song, when we
I love it.
do the simple things and the big things, that's all resistance. And I don't know, I want to be able to write about that reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm excited for it too. Thank you, Kaitlin. This has been real delight to have this conversation with you, and I'm grateful for all that you've shared with us.
Thank you so much.